We're glad to have you with us, and we are really looking forward to sharing with you some things that we've learned over many years and come to believe very deeply, that in the midst of a whole lot of turmoil that's going on both in the churches and in the culture around us, our conviction is that God is up to something, and God is up to something significant and profound, and that the Spirit of God, God's Spirit, is already at work out ahead of us in our churches and denominational systems. And God's up to stuff, and God is still inviting you as denominational and judicatory leaders and clergy leaders to participate in what God is doing. And so the webinar today is really focused around that conviction that we have and our experience in that. And in the webinar, we want to share this with a number of people who I want to introduce to you and who you can see. Our guest is Cheryl Kinder-Pyle. And Cheryl is a wonderfully exuberant executive presbyter from the Presbytery of the Inland Northwest, which is a great place to be. And so, Cheryl, we welcome you. And also the TMN team, Fiona Watts, who lives here in Vancouver, and John McClavity, who lives in in Toronto, are experienced members of TMN. And I'm Al Roxburgh, one of the founders of TMN, and I'm your host today. So let me give you an overview of the hour we're going to spend together. We thought that we'd begin by really doing an interview with Cheryl. Cheryl has been an executive presbyter for quite a number of years, and she's worked with this question of the need to fix the church, the systems that she has. So she's going to talk out of that as she and Fiona have conversation. And then out of that conversation, John and I are going to do some theological reflection. We're going to interact with Cheryl's sharing and really look at some of the underlying issues of fixing from the perspective of what God's up to. And then after that, we're going to move into a Q&A. But before we do that, we want to talk very briefly about an invitation to participate in learning communities. So again, thanks everybody. And I'm going to just hand it over now to Fiona and Cheryl.
Thanks, Al. So, Cheryl, let's just start. Let's just jump in. So, from where you are sitting in your role as the executive presbyter for the Presbytery of the Inland Northwest, what are you seeing as the current reality in the church? What are you noticing?
Well, thanks, Fiona. First, I want to just say real quick that we totally don't have the answers in the Inland Northwest, but we've been on this great journey with you guys, with the Missional Network, and it's good to be with all of you today. Our current reality is basically, in a word, decline. In the last 5 years, we've lost 25% of the membership in our region. So, in essence, if we were to continue this trajectory, there would be no Presbyterian folks in my region in 15 years. And I don't think that our story of decline is really unique to Presbyterians in the U.S. I think a lot of mainline denominations are experiencing this as well. And what we've seen are really, I think amongst my colleagues, two kind of responses. One is to just throw up your hands in despair and get into this anger and kind of blaming framework. And then a second one is just kind of hold really tightly and try and fix it. And at times, I need to counsel some pastors who I would call over-functioning pastors and remind them that their role is not to save the church. And I think the same is true for us, that we're not called to save our judicatory or save our denomination.
Right. So you're beginning to touch a little bit on how you're responding to the reality that you see happening on the ground, just by, framing up how you find yourselves responding to people's behavior in the midst of this sense of fear and decline. So what are some of the other things that you've learned, as you respond to this reality?
Sure. I think the overarching framework that is important for me, at least, is again that my job isn't to save, but to faithfully be looking for where God's at work. And for about 15 years, I've had a spiritual director, and she has really encouraged me to hold things lightly. And I do that in a couple of ways. One is by doing a lot of delegating, just claiming that Ephesians 4 passage where we're called to equip the saints for the work of ministry and not to do all of that on our own. And so we do that by empowering folks in mediation skills and in reconciliation so they can deal with those hot button churches or those areas of conflict and crisis that can just suck up so much time and emotional resources. Another thing is to just really allow death, in essence. We have a number of churches that we call less than critical mass churches, and I go to them and I meet with them and I listen and I allow them to grieve. But we've come to a decision whereby we're no longer giving maintenance grants or mission receiving grants to those churches for their operating budgets. We only are investing our limited resources in churches that are doing actual missional initiatives. And so that's another area where we've just pulled back from that. And then finally, I think nurturing those shoots of new life that we do see and being aware of where God is at work, and then spending time and energy with those churches.
So what would be an example of the sort of nurturing the shoots of new life when you think about that happening in your presbytery?
Yeah, there's several churches that we're seeing that happening in. And I would say the one that comes to my mind is Wilbur, which is a rural church. You know this church well. It actually is a partnership that started between the local ELCA church and the PCUSA church, which is not unusual, especially in rural areas. But what was unique here is that through my relationship with the other bishops, the Lutheran bishop and I worked with the Methodist bishop, and we ended up calling a Methodist pastor to this. And they've developed this partnership over the years and have joined us in our future church. We call our work with you all the Missional Network Future Church. And so they have developed this community garden and are working together in ways that are bringing not only sustenance and just survivability, but true thriving and some really exciting things happening there.
That's great. And what would you say about, do you feel like you've been doing this? I know that you don't feel like you've been doing this journey alone. So can you talk a little bit for you about what it's like to learn alongside others as you kind of grapple together in the presbytery about how to respond to these realities?
Yeah, it really has been important to do this with other folks because it can be kind of lonely, frankly. And I found a network of partners with our other local judicatory leaders. We call it the octet, though we're actually down to, I think, 6 of us. And those folks include, again, the ELCA bishop, the RCC bishop, United Methodist, Episcopal Disciples. And we gather together fairly regularly, actually, for breakfast at the Perkins. And then we also gather occasionally for social events and for one-day retreats.
And what about, sorry, go ahead.
There you go.
Okay, I was just going to say, and what have you noticed in terms of creating that similar kind of opportunity for congregations and pastors?
Oh, definitely. That with our work with you all, that has been really important to have those pastors meet together in their cohorts, as well as having the life leaders meet together in their cluster groups as well. And during that time, we just see the energy where they're sharing, they're listening to one another, they're sharing what they're discerning, and they're sharing what they're trying, the new things, the new experiments that they're trying, and what they've learned from that, where they've failed, where they've had successes. And that's just been a really rich conversation for everyone.
That's great. So let's think a little bit, turn attention a bit to the presbytery as a whole. So what are you seeing in terms of shapes of new life in your presbytery when you think about the presbytery as a whole?
Well, the first thing that we needed to do in order to nurture that new life was to really look at the structural organization of the presbytery. We needed to free people up because we had so many people with the limited time that they had to offer to the presbytery. They were trying to keep this big machine going. And so we've moved from 18 committees down to really 3 teams and then about 4 committees. So let me just show you a really quick visual here if you can see this. That was what we were.
Wow.
And this is where we are. And you can see these 3 teams with the leadership team in the middle. So much more condensed in terms of this big, huge machine that we had going. That was all based on Richard Chait's book, Governance as Leadership. And although that was a technical change that we did with the structural organizational stuff, it still freed up folks so that we could take some other folks and work on the generative work that we really needed to do and start addressing some of our challenges, particularly our adaptive challenge, and moving from that regulatory agency to the relational and missional agency.
And so what happened with your business time when you did that then?
Well, that was really interesting because what we used to have was a whole long day of what we called a presbytery meeting, and it would go from 9:30 in the morning till 3, and we would have worship and stuff in there, but it was this business formal meeting the whole day long. And honestly, it was something that I even just dreaded because it just was so laborious and frankly quite dull. So what we did was we condensed the important business part of the meeting to an hour and a half at most, really. And that's only for the true business that we needed the entire presbytery for, to do actionable kind of items like examining candidates for ministry.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of the time we had an extended worship time. We extended the lunch time for relational building and conversation. And we created this new section called Open Space. And that's a really exciting aspect of our presbytery where people come together and in the large gathering, whoever has an idea for what they would like to talk about that day, they raise their hand and they say, you know, like for example, last time we met, someone stood up and said, I'm wondering about how other pastors are handling the election. As you can imagine, the election in the U.S. has been very tumultuous for our churches as well. And so he said, you know, I'd just like to gather with other pastors and find out how you're handling the election in your congregation. So those folks went off to a certain area of the room, and other folks went off and talked about refugee families and welcoming refugee families into the neighborhood. Another group went off and talked about the National Church meeting this last summer and what some of the decisions that had been made. And so it's this very organic experience whereby if people have an idea of something that they'd like to talk about with other people, they just gather together, they listen to one another. There's a facilitator who volunteered to lead that. And it's been very rich and energizing for the whole day. We put that early in the day because we find that then the rest of the stuff is energized by the conversation as well.
So that actually frames up some of what your business conversation, then if people are coming into the business conversation having already had that experience.
Absolutely.
So
a new tone.
You set a new tone.
Yeah.
So how have the folks in the presbytery responded to this shift?
Well, they've responded really well, in part because we used to have what we called Presbytery Day, where there was a day long of workshops, and that was very well attended, and people liked to share best practices and things of that nature. And so this was almost like incorporating a little bit of that energy and excitement and that conversation into every gathering. And I'm sorry if you hear that train; it's really loud.
We do hear it.
That's okay. We can't stop the trains going by. They got to do their job too. Sounds like the train's still going by. Yeah. All right. No problem. So, so it's been really well received. Lots of space for people to sort of move as the Spirit is calling them, and nudging them to engage in conversation with others as well. So has there been, have people been comfortable with the level of engagement with the business still? Like, do you still feel like you're getting your work done?
Oh, absolutely. We definitely are getting the work done. We also have a structure whereby some of the work has been now delegated to other committees, like a committee on ministry. Mm-hmm. And so what we do as a large body is just the things that we really feel that we need to do all together. Mm-hmm. And so we're no longer having those meetings, the information sharing, because it's just not an effective way to really share information with all the other mediums that we have today. So we've taken out those prolonged announcements during the meeting time, and we just have actual business that we do.
So it sounds like it's created some energy. It's changed the tone of how your business is conducted, and that it's also this new sort of structure and function and willingness to create open space has also enabled people to participate in the life and the functioning of the presbytery in a different kind of way. Would you say?
Most definitely, and in a way that interests them, because each of us has our own ministries that we're passionate about. And this way we can really develop those and have conversation with folks that we really want to partner with in those ministries.
Right. That's great. Thanks, Cheryl. So I'm going to pass it back to Alan and John and just say, like, as you listen to what Cheryl's describing, what are you hearing?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Cheryl. And just before John and I jump into that, I know a number of you have joined since we began, and I just direct you to the chat box at the bottom near the right, where you can connect and comment, and particularly if you want to do Q&A. Just some brief reflections. At one level, Cheryl has described as an executive presbyter some of the work that she needed to do in terms of the overburden of structure and committees. And so she held up that picture of what was and kind of a clean down place. And I think what Cheryl is very aware of is that those are really necessary things, but they are only the beginning point for something much broader and much deeper. That, in a sense, when she began to do that, she wasn't trying to fix the system, but create space in it for something else. And I think one of the things I would observe is that in our work with multiple denominational systems, the anxiety that a lot of execs are experiencing it's an inbuilt, almost in the bones sense that they are responsible for making something happen. That there is inside of them this deep sense that they've been called into a position of leadership, and therefore they need to have solutions and answers to fix the problems. And that's a deep anxiety that's present. And it's in all of us. I mean, I've been a parent long enough to know it doesn't just exist. That's a normative default that's there, that's going on. And it's really critical to say that in terms of what we're observing. I think the second thing in terms of this need to fix that Cheryl was pressing into was that the systems that we know are the systems that we know. And we got to the positions that we've got to largely because we've been good at managing them. And so the default inside of us is to try to manage and deal with the systems that we know. But the fundamental issue underneath is that the way these systems have been constructed are simply no longer sufficient or adequate for the spaces and the contexts in which we find ourselves. And therefore, all the fixing in the world is not going to address the underlying issues. And for us, it is a learning that we've done over a number of years that in this unraveling of systems that are going on, it is God who is present. And while it would take more time to describe, that this unraveling and this anxiety and this awkward space is actually a work of the Spirit of God. And that God's Spirit is inviting us into a place that requires a much different kind of leadership. And it's a leadership that's about listening and discerning what is already happening and bubbling amongst God's people themselves, so that in congregations, amongst clergy, there is already a bubbling up of the work of the Spirit. Often people can't name it that way, and therefore the work of leadership is not primarily to try to fix, but how in the midst of the space of unraveling to invite God's people to hear and listen and discern the ways the Spirit is creating new life amongst them. That's the fundamental shift. The challenge of that shift is that we as leaders will only be able to do that kind of leadership to the extent that we lay down our need to come up with fixes and programs and strategies. And that's an awkward space. But that's the space into which God is inviting us, that letting go. And an example of that, and I'll ask John to talk a little bit about this. For us, we use the Luke 10 text a great deal, and many of you know it. But another text that we've discovered helps us a lot understand this is Acts 16. And if you think of Paul as a denominational exec going to revisit the churches, Acts 16 tells an interesting story. John, why don't you share a little bit of that? And John, you've got to unmute yourself.
I just unmuted myself.
There you go.
Technologically from Toronto. Well, I think most of us will understand what the passage is. The passage from Acts 16 is Paul's vision of the man from Macedonia and leads into the conversion of Lydia. And you might remember that Paul is on a journey and he feels that he needs to go to one specific place. He has expectations to be there, and he's forbidden by the Holy Spirit to go to Asia. Then they go and attempt to go to another place, and again, they are forbidden to go there. And it's only as they take some time and make some space to discern what God is saying to them that they find where they need to go. Somebody that was doing Dwelling in the Word with me about a month ago said, here's Paul looking for a man. In the end, he finds a woman. He finds Lydia. And it's an intriguing passage because God is up to the unexpected. But I think for our sense, in terms of my hearing what Cheryl was saying, is that you have taken some really big risks to do business differently. And I think that you see that in the Acts passage. How do we discern? How do we create new spiritual practices to understand what the Spirit of God is up to? So if the Spirit of God is indeed out in front of us, how do we discern that? And what practices do we have in our leadership lives to be able to discern that and to understand that? And I think that's a huge shift of moving away from practice as normal And it helps us in the midst of the defaults, which are so easy to go back to.
Yeah, thanks, John. For us and for many execs, this has been a really helpful opening space. And in a lot of ways, in the work we do, it's how do you begin to create tables and safe spaces for people in the congregations and clergy to begin to name the places of disruption and to name the places of hope. So this is not so much how do we bring a new discipleship program to churches, or how do we bring a new missional strategy to churches. It's not that. It's this confidence that God, in the midst of unraveling, is at work, and God is ahead of us. And it is then the capacity to let go of the need to bring, but create these spaces. And the conviction that in those spaces, God is at work. And the answers to the questions, what do our churches need to look like, begin to emerge. What makes this so difficult, and I would own this myself, is that we were all trained in a context of management and control, in the belief that with the right information, the right input from experts, we can manage and control the outcomes we want. But that's not the world we live in anymore. And so, as Cheryl's pointed out, another thing that we're learning amongst execs is that this is not a journey that any of us can take by ourselves. It's a journey where we need each other to co-learn and co-discover, because it's about learning a whole new set of skills and capacities that we've all got to learn at this beginning. So those would be some of the what we would call theological framings of what we're learning. That doesn't get into the practical how-tos. You heard Cheryl describe fairly extensively some of the, or hint at some of the processes that are involved there. She talked about experimenting, about learning cohorts and all that sort of thing. But underneath that, for us, the massive shift is a shift from this default conviction that we can manage and control and program our way into a different future and to fix our churches, to a recognition that beyond the fix, God is up to stuff. And our vocation and calling in these systems is to begin to create the spaces to listen and create experimenting amongst God's people. John, anything else you want to put in at this point?
Well, I think, Alan, it's moving from being managers, as you've talked about, into having a new imagination about what our leadership role is. And I think we've talked about that new imagination of being detectives of divinity, to being poets, to being midwives of what the Spirit of God already is up to. And I think that I find that the kind of expectations that there are on leaders today to fix is so immense that it's really hard to move into this new sphere. But that's where the Spirit of God is working. And we can get fixated on loss and all those kind of things. But as Cheryl said, in moving into listening to the Spirit, discerning what the Spirit's up to, she's seen a whole shift within her system that is approaching mission and work in a very different way. And they're moving towards being midwives of what the Spirit is up to. And they're moving towards hope, which it's easy to get into the negative.
Thanks, John. We want to invite you into some Q&A, and you can do that on the chat, put in your questions, and we can interact with those. So you may want to be thinking about some of the questions you want to have and the ways you want to interact. Before we go there, just want to share with you an invitation that we have around something called Joining God Learning Communities. As I've said, our conviction is that none of us can go on this journey by ourselves, but amongst us all, as God's people, we do have the capacities to discern and experiment. And so out of this topic, letting go of the need to fix the church, we are wanting to invite you to look at ways of digging deeper into this. And what we're doing is creating learning communities. And these learning communities are designed around the recognition that each of your contexts are unique and that there's no magic bullet. There's no, take off the shelf binder that's going to fix all this. But we can't do it by ourselves, and we need one another. There's much to learn. A learning community is an opportunity for numbers of you as execs to come together in a small cohort of peers and begin to work and wrestle together with the question of how do we shift from fighting fires to building a future around God's mission. The kind of learning communities that we're creating are not add-ons, extras that you load on top of your already busy schedules. What they do is literally provide you the opportunity with others to do just-in-time learning and reflecting and testing around what's actually going on in your context and around the work that you're already doing. So what we're offering is a joining God learning community for you as execs, and some of you whose pastors are in exec positions. The information for all of this is on a link on our website, and we invite you to go there. But in January of 2017, we're beginning an exec learning community around the subject of letting go of our need to fix the church. Each learning community will be comprised of 5 to 7 execs. You'll meet together over 12 months. The meetings will be facilitated by a TMN coach and will be done in this medium of video conferencing together. The cost for that over a year will be $2,400 US at around $210 a month. So we want to invite you to consider this, to take a look on our website. There's limited space. As we say, we're beginning one with 5 to 7 people. But we want to offer you who are on this webinar priority of placement to participate in it. So take a look at it and see what's involved. We will send you a follow-up email with lots of details. And there's also going to be a poll that you can respond to that will take you about 30 seconds. So we just invite you to go there, consider joining. But now let's shift back to Fiona, and you might lead us in a Q&A.
Okay, so as has been mentioned a few times, there is a chat feature on this webinar where, if you haven't already explored it, you can put your questions in the chat box, and we'd be happy to take some time to field some questions, whether they be questions for Alan or for John or for Cheryl about what's happening in the Presbytery of the Inland Northwest. So I am watching this, I'm watching the chat, and so please feel free to post your questions. Okay, so first question, naming places of disruption and places of hope. How do we do this?
I could jump in quickly.
Sure.
I'll give you my experience, and then Cheryl, you may want to. When I sit with a group of people in a congregation, for example, and you could do that anywhere, around a table at home or anywhere, it doesn't take long for them to begin naming the places of disruption. And so those are things that are easy and begin to happen once you create the kind of safe space. In terms of the places of hope, the same thing begins to happen. So we do some very simple things around tables, often with meals. We do dwelling in the Word. And in the midst of dwelling in the Word, we ask simple things like, where in the text have you seen God at work this week? Or as you're out and about in your congregation or in the store or in the gym, what are you noticing? And in other words, the places of hope are not big things. They're just ordinary places of everyday life that people can begin to name. Now, that for me is very practical and hopeful, and it comes out of this conviction again that as the Spirit of God is raising people's anxieties about what's not working, the Spirit is also giving people places of hope. So to me, it's table, it's conversation, it's listening for that in the other, not me defining it for them. But Cheryl, John?
Okay, I'll jump in. So we deal with this each time we gather as a full presbytery. And what we call the places of disruption in our presbytery, we've nicknamed it the death spiral. And part of it, of naming it, actually is really helpful, just to acknowledge and name that this is in our midst. In other words, on Thursday, our presbytery will be gathering all day, and we will deal with closing one of our churches. And it will be discouraging, and it will be heavy, and it will be sad. And so we're really intentional about how we do that. We're intentional about beginning with worship together. And then we do the business, when we have really heavy business like this, we do that next. And then we go to the vision team and the exercises and the experiments that we're going to be doing in terms of listening to one another in the afternoon, and then ending with some time of worship again. So we're really intentional about how we frame the meeting, and we're intentional about how much time we spend on each aspect of the gathering day, so that we will spend maybe 15, 20 minutes on this closing of this church, but we're going to spend an hour and 20 minutes on the listening to one another, and we're going to have this exciting experiment of videoing one another and then posting those to our Facebook page and such. So we're really intentional about those two things, how we frame the day, and then also how much time we actually are literally spending on the death spiral stuff, and how much time on the stuff that does give us life.
I guess, though, too, that it's not to take away from the fact that you do need to acknowledge those places of sadness and lament and grief, and honor them for what they are as part of acknowledging the effect of disruption, and also hold up that larger space of hope, so that the disruption and the sense of anxiety and fear doesn't take over how people are feeling about being part of the work of the presbytery. I think, Cheryl, there's another question here that I think might be good for you to answer, and this is, what are the steps that you see pastors taking to let go of their need to fix the church? What does that look like for them?
I think that's a more difficult challenge for our pastors, because we've instilled the sense that they are responsible as leaders. That's their job. And so again, I think being together in a network of a cohort group, and that cohort learning and encouraging one another, allowing them again to share their struggles, but then also find places of hope and things that they can experiment with and try and develop their capacities as missional leaders has been really important for our pastors.
John, you could tell a story about, I can't remember her name now, but on the East Coast, whose whole adaptive challenge was how to let go. You know the one I mean?
Yes, I do. I think for most clergy, and I think for most executives, there is this high degree that people need to be in control and need to be seen as being able to lead and to be able to fix. And many of our situations is that we're either clergy-centric, everybody's looking to us for answers. I have two clergy people that are part of an Episcopal system out on the East Coast that had made their challenge to sort of let go of that need to be in control and to fix. and are learning how to pass the work back to their people. And they've said that very openly and framed that in their system to their leadership, and have asked for help to work that out even within their system. And it's been amazing to see the sense of relief and the sense of joy that these leaders are now having, to see that their task is very different, and it's rooted in a very different spiritual discipline. And I guess the thing I'd want to say to you is that this process takes time, and you need to allow there to be time. It's a time of discernment, and I think it's also a time of patience. That if the Spirit of God really is out there, that God will speak into where we are as we allow that to happen. And I've just seen a lot of clergy's lives transformed out of letting go of that need.
Just add to that, I was out on the East Coast with that diocese about 2 weeks ago, and that clergy person with her team was sharing with us what they're doing in the neighborhood, and it just brought tears to my eyes. Both her capacity to let go and enter a different kind of leadership, and to listen to the stories of those people in their engagements in their neighborhood. It was a great experience.
So there's a question here from Michael, and his question is, changing the culture of the parish, how long does it take, on average, does it take, till the majority of the people get it?
You've got to be completely realistic here that the cultures that exist in our churches have probably taken, to be kind, at least 50 or 60 years. To be realistic, they've been in the bones of people, passed on for 150, 200 years. So this is not a 1 year or a 6 month journey. If to begin to change the culture of a congregation is a minimum of an 18 to 24 month journey. But it's a lifelong journey, because what you're really doing is inviting people not to think about change the organization, but you're inviting people into a new set of habits and practices that you want to become normative. And if any of you try to take on a new sport, you'll understand that doesn't happen overnight.
And if I could say to Michael, just knowing a little bit about where you're from, you are doing lots of really good things to make space for your parish to learn these new things, but it does take time.
And I think I would add that I would question whether the goal is truly to get the majority of the people to get it. I think a system can change when you have some of the leadership leading in that way, not just the pastor, of course, but to hope for the majority of the people. Some people, I'm not sure, will ever truly get it. And I think that's okay.
So there's a bit of a freedom in that then. That it's not so much about a critical mass, but about a movement, about a shift in direction. And not everybody has to be on board with that before you see the fruits of that change beginning to emerge. Are there any other questions out there from people? Oh, here's one. When you, as an executive pastor, learn to practice to let go of the need to fix, there are others who haven't made the shift. How do you deal with the frictions that happen between those different visions? Oh, that's a good question.
It's a great question. To a large extent, the letting go of the need to fix, how would I answer this succinctly? From the perspective of an executive of a system, and Cheryl can attest to this, you want to begin by taking care of the expected needs of the system and the people within it, and not trying to upend and change all of that. What Cheryl did, and she can speak for herself, she sought to, what I would say, simplify what existed, not radically change it. In the midst of that, what you want to do is you want to invite a small number of congregations and their clergy to experiment. That's really the journey that we're talking about. And in the midst of that experimenting, you don't lift it up as the answer. You lift it up as an invitation to others, and you bless what others are doing and going on. Now that tends to reduce the friction, because the friction in systems tends to emerge when congregations and clergy feel that the center, the judicatory, is saying, this is the journey. This is what we all need to do. And as you know, especially if you're Scotch-Irish Presbyterian, that's just going to create a fight. So you take that off the table. So that's one of the ways of doing it. In our work, we put it this way. If you want to change a culture, don't try to change the culture. The worst thing you can do is create what we call whole systems change. What that does is create just what you're describing, the friction, the pushback. You create experiments out on the edges, and you relax and let it take place. But Cheryl, you may have more comments about that.
Well, similar to a pastor in a church that's dealing with a women's ministry that is no longer really meeting the needs of the young moms in the church, you create other things, kind of like what Al was saying, that go alongside it, as opposed to killing off something. You just allow those to coexist. I think the other thing that we need to do, though, as pastors and execs, is along with letting go of our need to fix, we need to let go of the need to be liked by everyone. And we need to be able to withstand some of that friction and just be okay with that.
There's other couple questions here around the idea of experimenting. One of them is, how do you encourage people, especially those with influence or power, to be comfortable when your experiments don't work?
Yeah.
And then sort of related is, how do you navigate tension of waiting and listening for God to lead you and the risk of experimentation? So being too passive versus being too ambitious. So maybe let's do the experimenting one first, when the experiments don't work.
Go ahead, John.
Well, experiments are experiments. And, you know, if you're learning from experiments, most experiments don't work. I think you can look at that in any kind of field and know that first things out don't always bring what we expect them to bring. But it's only as you act into something that change is going to happen. And if something doesn't work, then you have to reflect on that and take time to reflect and discern about why it didn't work. And what you come up with is new questions and new spaces to lean into and to learn. And at that point, you start to sharpen what those experiments are, rather than pass, fail, successful, not successful, all of those kind of things. I have the right thing to plug in. What you're in is that discernment journey again of learning what really is, what God is up to and what's going to work in that situation.
I would just add to that I think sometimes people see experiments as solutions, not as experiments.
Right.
And so if a solution doesn't come forward, then it seems that it doesn't work. But as John was saying, experiments are about learning. They're not about answers.
And it's all about how you set them up. You can't just do experiments. You've got to create a context within them. And so in terms of leadership, what we do all the time is that we allow the leaders of a congregation to watch and observe an experiment which is going to be low risk for the congregation, so they can begin to get what that's about. And then the rest of it, in terms of experiments not working, all of that comes out of a process of people testing and trying and reflecting. But in our experience, experiments to a large extent, whether they work or don't work, create a new kind of energy amongst people in a congregation. And that's as critical as anything else.
So what about this question around navigating the tension of waiting and listening for God to lead and the risk of experimenting? So the tension between being seen as being passive versus being too ambitious. What would you comment about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm clear on the question. One of the things that we advise all the time, both at the judicatory and congregational level, is to begin with small and simple experiments, not overly ambitious ones, so that you can begin to do what we call early wins. If your experiment is too long, and people have not done this before, they will tire. If it's too ambitious, it will fail and they will be discouraged. So there's a work of wisdom amongst leaders that are required to just really discern that right space. The second thing is that the experiments have always got to be this judicious mix of how does this experiment stretch people beyond where they are, but not so far that they get terrified. So those would be some observations, but I don't know whether I'm answering the question.
I would say along with that, Alan, that one of the things we're learning is that quality of patience. And that may be a surprising word to use here, but I think that the God of the Old Testament, New Testament, in some of the chaos of the biblical narrative, is a God of extreme patience. And it's learning how to be patiently waiting, seeking, discerning how the Spirit is going to act, and learning how to become more comfortable, how to live in ambiguity, which again roots us back into some spiritual practices.
I think too that, I mean, the way that I think about experiments is coming out of discernment work that's happening in a local context. And at the same time, though, it's not like a major epiphany that people are seeking before they take action. So just as a quick example, there's a congregation in Seattle that was working with, they had agreed to participate in a community service day where they were going to work together with other people in the community to get the school ready to open at the beginning of the school year. And their experiment was super simple. They had agreed to go and be part of this, and their experiment was to come back from that experience with 3 names and 1 story of somebody that they had interacted in the course of doing that work in the schools. So they had already felt that call to participate in this community service project. But what they did was they took that opportunity and they shifted it so that they could learn about the people that were in the community, about the people that they were serving alongside. So there's another question here about discernment process and the connection between the ancient work of spiritual direction. And the question is, have you been looking at connections in any particular ways between discernment process and spiritual direction? I think this will be the last question that we have time for. So who wants to take that one?
John, why don't you? I would just say yes, 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 yes. What happens all the time is that people don't discern, they default. And when they look at their communities or their neighborhoods, they immediately default to, here's the way we can help people and meet their needs. And all of that is about people in churches staying in control. Discernment is about how you listen to God, which has got nothing to do most of the time with meeting needs and helping people. But John, you may want to talk more about that.
No, I think you're on to something. I mean, this is a very significant and deep question, and I think that in the work that we've done, the places where we find with executives and with pastors is this need to develop new spiritual practices and to deepen that place of discernment and listening, and that there is a place for us to recover places in the early church where people did this. We have discomfort with ambiguity. We have discomfort with not being in control. You know, all of those places, all of us are like that. At least I'm like that. Maybe the rest of you aren't. But it's somehow being rooted back into the biblical narrative that sees God's Spirit out in front of us, working in the midst of chaos, and believing that, and having those practices around us that root us.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being on, for being with us, and for participating. We're going to be doing more of these, but at this point in time, we've shared a link with you in the chat, and we just invite you to consider participation in the learning community that we're going to initiate in January. And we just hope that you are blessed by this and you learn a little bit about how to make this shift from fighting fires to building a future of God's mission. So again, check out the learning community. Thanks for being there with us today, and God's blessings in your work. Cheryl, thanks so much for your great participation. Thanks, everybody.